Fight!
You know what that intro music means. Good evening. Welcome to Theory Fight Night, or whatever time of day it is for you. More accurately, this is kind of political theory fight night, which is what happens when you let Victor choose the reading. Thanks very much,
At least
buddy.
there was some like edgelordy post-structuralists for you to enjoy.
Yeah. This is our, actually, of the fight nights, this is our third Jacques in a row.
Shit, I didn't even realize that.
The last two featured Jacques Derrida. And while I was taking my notes for this episode, I just wanted to give a shout out to the OG Jacques. This is, of course, Brian Jacques, who first inspired my reading of fantasy in the broadest sense, which I continue to this day. Do you guys know who that is?
No idea who that is.
The guy who wrote Redball.
Yep.
I never read the books. I watched the show for a couple seasons. Never really got into it though. Never enough to pick up the
Fueled
books.
my childhood in the 90s with books and TV shows. Yeah, they were great.
It's a Arthurian anthropomorphic mice. But as a 9-year-old, I can remember crying twice, or for two reasons at least. One, because I didn't have any friends, and two, because Martin the Warrior, who is a mouse, his girlfriend mouse got killed by a slave-owning weasel, and then he had to leave all of his friends. So, yes, I felt great empathy to the point of tears for a fictional sword-wielding mouse. And isn't it the tragic irony that the interest by which you cope with having no friends also that which guarantees that you will not have any friends in the future by virtue of those interests?
We're friends. It's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel that unlike medieval Animal Farm fiction, we here do not feel that strange women in ponds handing out swords is a basis for a system of government. That's critical.
Nice way
theory.
to wrap in a bunch of pop culture references into a singular whole there. What's that? Are we suddenly going to become a narco-syndicalist? Is that the idea?
We must learn from the mice.
Chomsky, I don't know. Can you relate Chomsky to this? I guess Habermas and Honneth are probably very aware of Chomsky
Yeah.
and the
Oh, yeah, for
universal
sure.
grammar.
We haven't even actually said what we're doing today.
Yeah,
by the
who
way,
is
yet.
brawling here? Who is brawling? It is fight night. On one side of the screen, player one, insert coin, Jacques Ranciere. So our third Jacques of the mentioned in the hour, and insert coin player two, Axel Honneth. And you might be asking, who the hell is that? Well, Victor is going to tell you. Again,
Yeah, so
he picked this episode. Don't worry, someone else will be picking next week.
Did you hate this much, Pills?
Well, I didn't know who he was, but
Really?
I felt like I was reading Habermas. And sure enough, when I checked, he was supervised by Habermas. And at least I know that he has one thing in common with Habermas, and that he was ostensibly born into this world to lose debates. Because Habermas, as you know, was handedly defeated by Gadamer, Luhmann, Foucault, and I don't know if Rawls beat him or not. Of course, I wouldn't have read that one. But
Yeah.
I feel like he's carrying on the tradition here.
I don't know anybody who thinks that Gadamer won that debate. I agree that Derrida seems to have won the debate against him. Even he seemed to concede that. But
It's also
Gadamer's
worth
reputation
mentioning.
has kind of gone downhill since some of the Nazi connections came up.
I was just going to say it's worth also stressing that in this case, like the verses is a very direct verses. It's actually in a book, it's like published, which is like specifically framed as like a debate between the two thinkers, which made it, I guess, kind of easy for us to, because there's even a section in the book where they're going back and forth on certain points. So I thought that made for interesting reading, in my opinion, at least. And I thought there was enough post-structuralism and stuff, and Rancière was interesting enough that I was hoping that you guys would still find it interesting.
Yeah, I shouldn't pick on you because it's also all about recognition, and we've constantly, it feels like, brought up the dialectic of recognition. So this is the dialectic of recognition as a foundation for politics.
Which is Honneth's view.
Honneth, yeah. Or is that how it's pronounced? Honneth?
I don't know.
Honneth.
I hear it.
Hon.
I think
who knows?
Eric, you know German. What do you say, Honneth?
I don't know. So does he have an umlaut on his O?
No.
Then
No.
it's probably Honneth.
Yeah, so I can explain. I mean, you just said he was supervised by Habermas, but yeah, he's a political theorist who is does come from that lineage of critical theory via Habermas. So in that case, isn't really critical theory or true critical theory and he tends to come down more on the liberal side, and he grounds a lot of his political thought on this kind of dialectic of recognition. He wants to ground justice claims on this idea that there's these spheres of recognition that he kind of aligns up with a Hegelian dialectic of recognition of sort of how the subject develops through being recognized by others, and he kind of infers from that and makes his own version of that and tries to say that justice claims are grounded on a lack of being recognized, or in other words, that the subjectivity of the citizens in this political state haven't sufficiently developed or are suffer some deficit in a sphere of recognition, and he basically says justice claims and emancipatory struggles are really just struggles for recognition, based on those dialectics.
If you want to know something funny, Pils, you're not the only one who found his work a little bit bland. So back in 2014, Axel Honneth wrote actually a pretty good book called Freedom's Right that I quite enjoy, and I'll probably draw some arguments for it when discussing this. But he released a book just 2 years later called The Idea of Socialism, where he said the number one accusation leveled at this book was it was boring, not particularly radical, and didn't say anything interesting. So I wrote this book, The Idea of Socialism, to just say, no, I am actually radical enough. We can resuscitate this socialist ideal in the 2010s, and that'll be kind of hip and different, right? So don't worry. He seems to have some anxiety about this as well as a third generation Frankfurt schooler. Got to get back to that radical core.
I love how it's a valid critique now that your book is boring, and so that somehow indicts your theory. I mean, even Kant wrote that about his own critique when he wrote the Prolegomena after the first critique. He said this is long, dense, boring tract that nobody's going to read, and he said that about himself.
Well, Freedom's Right is a good book, and I think one of the arguments that he kind of rehearsed here about the importance of social or civic freedom, as it's sometimes called, is actually extremely important and legitimate as a critique of right Hegelianism. And it's worth noting that one of the things that Honneth and the others did that I think was genuinely innovative is in the 1980s, Hegel was kind of going through one of his periodic tenures as kind of an enemy on the left. And starting in the 1990s, you had these kind of center-left figures like Honneth, like Sela Ben-Habib, like Charles Taylor, probably most prominently in his book, essay, The Politics of Recognition, that kind of resuscitated his reputation and tried to use him to advocate for multicultural, pluralistic, broadly social democratic policies, right? And Honneth is very much in that school. But as the Quantfillos have said, a lot of people don't find his kind of tolerant, multicultural, democratic, social democracy all that interesting. So he seems to be trying to move in a bit more of a radical direction recently, a la, this resuscitation of the idea of socialism and workplace democracy in his recent.
I guess for our audience, to help you locate Honneth, he is the current fourth generation leader of the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, Germany, which is housed and originally known as the Frankfurt School. So after Horkheimer, somebody took over. Who was it? It wasn't Marcuse, was it? I think there was a sort of a period where they were all in America after Horkheimer, kind of.
Yeah. In the 1930s, what happened is they all had to flee Nazi Germany, and it's actually Erich Fromm who was able to get them an appointment at Columbia. It's actually kind of an interesting story because what happened is Fromm was originally the only person who got an appointment at Columbia, and his condition for them accepting him was they had to bring the whole institution along. And originally Columbia said, no, we didn't want to bring all these German guys. But Fromm was so hot at that point that eventually he got his way. And so everybody kind of transitioned over there.
Wait, if they were at Columbia, why were they all living in Cali?
I don't know. I imagine that they stayed there for a little while and then they transitioned outwards afterwards. I also don't imagine that there was really a big expectation that they spent a lot of time teaching.
It seemed like Adorno and Horkheimer wanted to spend as little time there as possible, judging by their writing. And then after this sort of period of exile, they came back and And the third wave was headed by Jürgen Habermas, who became extremely old, as people do over time. And then
Released a
the next
1,000-page
guy
book.
took over, which
Still
is
alive.
Honneth. Yeah, and Honneth is no spring chicken himself, but Honneth is the fourth, sort of the leader of the fourth wave of the Frankfurt School.
Becoming ever more liberal each wave.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And to the other side of the debate, I was
let's talk
also
about Rancière.
surprised to learn that Rancière is still alive, given that he has, I mean, I don't know this at all, but I assume that he has the vices of most French academics. And I was surprised, but he's, I don't know, must be in his mid-80s, because he was kicking it with Althusser and Derrida in the 60s already. So I'm a bit of a Rancière head. Out of practice Rancière head, but as some of our listeners, actually most probably do not know, I have a degree in art, and when artists want to read a philosopher, they've picked something that says aesthetics on it, and that's short. So because it's short and because it says aesthetics on it, Rancière's Politics of Aesthetics is commonly read by artists. Also commonly misread by artists because they have a little bit of a difficult time reading typically. So I learned this book a few times during art theory courses.
Which book?
The Politics of Aesthetics.
Oh yeah. So do you want to give a rundown then of what? So I already said that Honneth tries to ground his political theory on recognition, a dialectic of recognition, kind of like. I think what Honneth is also doing is, which he gets criticized relentlessly by Rancière for, of like trying to develop a thick account of subjectivity, because like he appeals to categories like suffering, he appeals to categories like recognition, and there's another category like
the opposition between the individual and the community kind of thing.
Well, that too, the opposition between the individual and the community, but also like these spheres of recognition also have to do with like the health of subjectivity and how well it functions. So he has kind of like a psychoanalytic, a psychological account of like subjectivity and how their ability to participate in these various spheres of society ultimately are like the ways that you can make justice and normative claims. And I think Rancière comes at it from a very different perspective, obviously. So I don't know if I will admit that I'm actually a fan of both of these thinkers. I think I probably come down a little bit more on the side of Rancière, at least in this specific text, but I think that they both make mistakes and they both make good points in this. But I don't know, Pills, if you want, as the self-described Rancière head, what does he ground his politics on?
Well, the easiest way to describe him is as a deconstructionist, but he makes a politics of aesthetics in the sense that you need, or that in politics, at least in capitalism, you don't really have a choice to, you don't have a chance to reorganize sense. And he means sense in like the Kantian sense of sense.
Sense perception.
Where if you're some sort of artist, and not specifically artist, right? We have a broader sense of aesthetics here, but a formal rearrangement of the material world, either through poetry or art or some kind of reorganization of material organization, allows you to reorganize the world sensually in some way.
Yeah, aesthetics isn't like a theory of beauty anymore in a lot of these modern texts. It has that broader meaning of sense experience, like aesthetic meaning the opposite of anesthetic, when you don't feel anything.
Right. And the idea is that like in capitalism, if you don't have capital, you don't have political power, but everybody has aesthetic power. Like anyone has the capacity to, write poetry, for example. So a radical politics in that sense. And then for him, politics is always deconstructive. I think he says all politics is insurrectionary for me. And this is one of the things that Honneth just
kind of denies it.
He just goes
later in this text.
I don't get it. I think he says something like, I'm sure there's an argument here, but I couldn't find it. So here's 3 possible options for what Rancière means. But yeah, if you know Derrida well, as we kind of do, then that's the approach that Rancière takes to politics, is that if you operate from the center out, or we might say is from the top down, then it isn't politics, because a politics of maintaining the center is the opposite of doing politics. So if you're maintaining something as it stands, then you're doing nothing. Thus, you have no power. Thus, you are not a political actor at that point.
Right. And I think like well, go ahead, Eric.
I was just going to say he has some very interesting ways he defines these terms, things he says about politics. Like for him, what politics actually implies is a kind of equality, right? Because he says things like a king who has a divine mandate to rule, that's not politics. Or a bureaucracy, or a bureaucracy of experts, let's say, who have this mandate to rule based on their greater knowledge of things. That's not politics either, because a political system implies that the government is at least ruling on behalf of those who have no power to make decisions, rather than the claim that this group of people has the authorization to make decisions, so they are the ones in charge. The reason he defines politics as kind of insurrectionary, or political action as insurrectionary, is because he has this sort of definition of politics that immediately excludes anything that's an anti-democratic from being called politics at all.
Yeah, politics can only occur where the rulers do not have the right to rule, which means that their rulership is always in question.
I mean, I found it interesting, but I mean, the politics is originally, I mean, he does quote Aristotle, but Aristotle also talks about politics as centered on the polis, the city. I don't know how that ties in, but it seems like he's got a very kind of idiosyncratic way of defining politics.
Yeah, well, it was my understanding that he defines politics he makes this distinction between the police and politics, right? So the politics are any moments that interrupt or create a rupture in the police. And what he means by the police is all the like business as usual norms that exist in society are just like maintaining their own inner logic, and like nothing changes.
Hegemony.
And so for him, that's why like even elections in a liberal democracy aren't politics. They're actually the police, because all of those elections are just like the same thing happening. There's nothing new going on here. It's just like another permutation of like the existing sensible world understanding of it. And everything, all the forces that maintain that business as usual sense of the world is what he calls the police, and not politics. Can't have politics in that. Politics is the only one that actually gets ruptured somehow by like that we start to change how we perceive or think about these kinds of values. They're reconfigured in some new way. And then, so that's in that sense, that's another sense in which his definition of politics is insurrectionary, because it can only actually occur when the sort of business as usual, that's my kind of understanding term that I'm using, is interrupted and disrupted somehow to make space for something else to emerge, which, well, then subsequently, I don't think he says it in this text, but he does in other texts, it's only going to be momentary. This, I think Rancière is in this tradition. There's a couple others in his field of thought who also think about politics as the moment of politics, right? It's like this momentary rupture, and then there's a reconfiguration.
That's very much
of the police.
Position.
Yeah, there's a reconfiguration of the police, and then there's a new police order that then's different. Maybe it's better, but we're not going to make a value judgment about it. But it's not politics. As soon as things are back to a norm, it's not politics anymore. That's my understanding.
I wanted to say that I personally found this debate broadly to be very, very tedious. Not because they didn't say interesting things, but because there was a lot of talking past one another. And I think both of them didn't really say anything that really amounted to anything of great gravitas, right? Rancière took a fairly common post-structuralist position, which is that this fixation that normal political theorists take on locating centers of power and criticizing them, and then trying to talk about countervailing centers of power, has a kind of intellectualist prejudice to it, because it allows the intellectual to speak about where power comes from and where it should be situated. And I think that that's absolutely an accusation you can make against Honneth, right? 100%. And I do like this idea, as any hippie does, of kind of narrativizing politics by not privileging one source of discourse over another, but allowing people to speak of their aesthetic experiences in the kind of broad sense that Eric was talking about, and leaving things open to continuous interrogation, right? But, in terms of what that would mean concretely, I find that the answer very, very thin. Not only that, he claims, I think rightly, that this doesn't lead to relativism, as it doesn't. But I do think that we need to assume the burdens of moral judgment at some point and point out that not all narratives are equal, right? I could sit here listening to an alt-right personality all day long. He can articulate why it is that he suffered a great deal at the hands of this minority and this woman, and she broke up with him, and what a bitch is she. But I have very little interest in granting that any kind of political legitimacy, right?
Yeah, well, you're shifting the terms of the debate by saying that because he doesn't give institutional examples or doesn't want institutional examples, that means that it's a thin account of democracy, because that's not what his purpose is. And we should say, go back to Ranciere's coming up in the French Academy, where he fits there. He was studied under Althusser, I believe, and then split with Althusser quite famously, because Althusser's revolutionary idea was that first we're going to have an intellectual vanguard that's going to come up with all the ideas for the revolution. And the point is, underlying that is the proletariat, the working class, they're too stupid to be able to, lead an uprising themselves. And Rancière took great offense to this idea and said, like, all the effective revolutions that we can ever point to are always spontaneous. The intellectuals theorize it after it's done, which again, back to what we talked about at the very beginning, why he writes on the politics of aesthetics, is that in aesthetics, everybody is equal. Politically, if we want to talk about politics in the sense that you're making it right here, then not everybody's equal. Then if you have money or can get access to money and backers, then you can have a political life. But in the aesthetic life, everybody potentially has a life, and that's where we see mass uprisings.
What do you mean by aesthetics is inherently equal? I'm not sure I follow.
Because for him, has to do with the sense, common sense. Everyone has a contribution to common sense, and particular to him is through art.
So
art in a
has
broad
a
sense.
contribution
Nobody
to
is
common
qualified.
sense.
Nobody is qualified to rule. Is another way I think he puts
So
it.
everyone's equally not qualified to rule. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, more or less.
That's why he says the one principle of politics is always equality. So if equality is not on the table, then politics is also not on the table.
Right.
Because if you normalize something like a meritocracy, right, wherein the best people are supposed to rule, right, then you're getting away from that idea. Or again, with like a monarchy with a divine mandate, right, you're getting away from that because they're the only ones qualified to rule.
Yeah, every single police order is premised on an exclusion, is like an important point that I think Rancière makes. So like any sort of like sensible business as usual structure of the world where we're like, these are our values, it's always going to be excluding some group or someone, and the police or being a political moment is when those excluded will come and interrupt that police order. But sorry.
Yeah,
Matt,
we should say also, just because we're going to keep using the term throughout the episode, police doesn't mean like what we think of as cops. Police is like the state.
Well, it's not just the state, though. Isn't it like also the dominant values of society, too?
Yeah, I guess you could say the whole, not just the repressive state apparatuses, but the ideological state apparatuses as well.
It's kind of a discursive and practical consensus that goes on. And the idea is to sort of form a break with that consensus, with political action.
It's a good way of putting it.
Introduce previously excluded voices into the conversation, and then there's this sort of circle of then it kind of becomes normalized again, and you fall back into the police state. That's what I got out of it. But it's important to note that Rancière is also an archivist, so he did loads and loads of work in the 1970s in the archives, looking at the history of the French working class movements and reading the works of French working class people who participated in various kinds of political action and discourse as well. So he draws quite a bit. It's not like it's all kind of groundless theory, as we might think of it. It's grounded in some careful analysis of some actual historical stuff as well. So he's not less historical in his orientation than the Frankfurt scholars would be.
Well, this is what I wanted to say, though. I think, again, the reason for this kind of dispute that Pills is highlighting is, again, a kind of methodological one, right? In that they're coming at things from two very different perspectives. And the tradition of French aesthetics, kind of colored by French Marxism and the revolutionary tradition, and the tradition of a kind of political sciencey appropriation of Frankfurt School themes that you see circa like Habermas and others, right? So one of the things that you find with French aesthetic theory, and I think actually Badiou does a lot better at expressing these kinds of points than Rancière does in this essay, is this fixation on the idea of a real politics of the event, as he calls it, right? That's revolutionary, where everything genuinely comes under contestation, and where previously excluded groups that weren't able to participate in the routine police of their country are actually incorporated, because the legitimation of the system breaks down and everything comes under question, right? And this is very much something that I think derives from their revolutionary history, right? And the kind of aestheticization of the French Revolution, 1789, almost every French thinker tends to engage in, right? For everyone else in the world who's not French, right? Like someone like Axel Honneth, the question almost immediately becomes, okay, there's this moment of radical inclusion, delegitimation that occurs that's actually extremely productive, because now you can ask political questions that you weren't able to before. But how are you going to cash that out practically? And this is a very serious problem, right? Because after the revolution is gone and you tear things down, year one is established, you need to build something in its place. And the problem with that is every kind of political system that we've devised thus far inherently, as Rancière points out, incorporates exclusions into its very makeup, right? Even the kind of radical social democracy or socialist democracy that someone like Honneth would want to put forward right now is predicated on a kind of exclusion, the exclusion of citizen and non-citizen, which is why I think Rancière is right to bring up how difficult it has been for France to incorporate people like the Algerians into the polity, right? But it's not clear how it is that you can overcome that. And I think it's right to actually raise that question the way that he does, Honneth, right? Which is to say, look, if you want a more participatory political system, you can't just aestheticize that. It's going to take really difficult technical questions, involve very difficult questions about who gets to participate, in what way, through what institutions, in what time, through what kind of mechanisms, most of which are really not all that aesthetically interesting, because frankly, they're fairly practical questions that most theorists find pretty boring.
Well, aesthetics and practice would be kind of tightly linked in this case, wouldn't it be? You have sort of sense as meaning, which links to knowledge and epistemology, and then you have sense as perception,
sure,
which links to everyday existence, which is kind of Rancière's. The reason Rancière has this play on disagreement, which you have a disagreement between like what you know and what the world, how the world actually like appears to you in a practical kind of everyday sense.
Yeah, I mean, the one criticism that I'd really raise of Honneth, sorry, Victor, I'll let you know then, is that he remains, like a lot of these left Hegelians are, the kind of center left Hegelians, people like Taylor, Benhabib, and Honneth. He's attracted to this idea of organic metaphors for society and politics, right? That you see Hegel espouse in the philosophy of right. That society is best conceived as an organism. It functions well when it incorporates everybody under certain egalitarian terms, yes, but qualified egalitarian terms. And if these break down, what you're going to see is disruption, chaos, and the misfunctioning or the malfunctioning of the social organism. And the usual left Hegelian argument, rather like he's saying, is that the way to solve this is more democracy, more recognition for groups that have previously been excluded, and more participatory forms of politics, all of which I like, right? But I do think that you could raise a legitimate Rancièrean objection, which is that by normalizing social conflict, by incorporating it into a kind of social organism, like the nation-state structure that Honneth remains attracted to, you also kind of blunt the edge of some of these radical disparities that we see in society by neutering them. And this is a critique.
No, you just perpetuate them, because every creating a center, and just what you're doing now, asking, give me the practical solutions, which Eric is right to point out they are aesthetic. Give me the practical solutions is necessarily going to be part of that hegemony. The point that Rancière is making is that it's never done. So when your goal is equality, your telos of your society is equality, then that's never done, because that's a goal that's irreconcilable with reality, but you can always do something.
Sure, but what I'm saying is that ultimately there are practical questions you can ask, even about something like equality, right? There's a very good book by T.M. Scanlon where he asks equality of what, right? Equality can be measured along a huge number of different metrics, right?
Yeah,
Material
and I think
equality.
that's what Rancière is saying. You can have
They
resources,
get into that a bit.
resources, abilities, opportunities, equality of outcome,
Capacities.
equality of punishment, like we talked about in our last episode. So the whole thing is to keep that thing at the center of politics, and that is for Rancière the center of politics. So you're kind of blunting the actual critique by saying, well, it's thin because he doesn't give me a practical outlook or a practical model for what society should look like, because that's not the point.
Okay, but it is then though, in my opinion, right? Because
Yeah,
ultimately,
I know you think that.
Yeah, but I'm right. So give me a second. And the reason is that these kind of practical political questions are actually what most everyday politics are about, right? Like when we're talking about something, let's go to Eric's example. Should we have a formally equal meritocracy, or should we have a more substantively equal social democracy, right? These are very technical questions that will involve a great deal of highly specified considerations about how to organize the economy, how to redistribute goods, what kind of institutions we should create, both at the macro and the micro level, most of which are frankly pretty boring, right? They're things that policymakers are more concerned with rather than political theorists, but they're absolutely essential to actually answering this question in a meaningful way, right? And to just aestheticize them by saying, well, we're going to endlessly postpone this by saying that this is continuous negotiation. I agree that that's true, right? But at some point, we also have to assume the burdens of moral judgment and say that this is what equality is going to look like as instantiated in our political community right now, and to try to make it as inclusive and as egalitarian as possible, and to specify what that would actually entail at any given place and at any given time. I'll give a very good example, right?
Before you give an example, now you're just glossing this and not addressing why he's bringing this idea up in the first place, which is to counter the idea of recognition as the foundation of politics.
Yeah, but I've already said I don't agree with that.
Okay, well, then you're making an extraneous argument to the text. I'm sorry not to cut you off, but we have to stay on point here. If the issue is that you cannot demand of someone that he assemble a model politic for you, when politics is something that accounts for juridical judgments in order to displace them, because those judgments are always going to displace particular action.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, isn't the idea that like you lay out those blueprints for the best kind of society, right? And you've already, in that sense, divorced them from practice, because you've said what we should be doing and these are the steps we need to follow. And you've already excluded so many people from this discourse because you're having this sort of expert argument about what is the best sort of society, and there's all these technical questions, which implies that normal people can't answer these technical questions. And what you're really doing is getting at the disagreement between how are we supposed to be normative? How do we make normative claims? What are their proper place? Do they come before the sensible everyday, or do they sort of follow from it, as Rancière would say? I mean, the normative is one of the central points of disagreement here. Like any question, how should society be? What should we do? Like, give me the next step, the practical solution to this problem. All of these are normative questions. And if you just say, well, that's what we need, then you're just exactly glossing over Rancière's entire, like a huge pillar of his critique of all of this.
Well, I've been wanting to say something, okay, for a little while, and I think what you just said, Eric, touches on exactly what I wanted to say, which is, to me, it seemed like it was hard to tell with Rancière whether he was really offering anything normative or if it was really just descriptive, right? Because in a way, it seems like he's just describing and redefining what politics, what the everyday, what the like institutional ideological structures are, what those moments are, but he's not saying anything about like how things should be. And I mean, so, but then he like, and I think that my issue with him is that it seems like he's trying to smuggle in normativity but like avoiding saying it. And you know, yes, I think that it can be located. They always do that. Yeah, of course. They always do that.
It's true.
But, and like, so hold on, let me finish here. So it's located, I think we talk about exclusion, right? So like, I think that from a Rancièrean perspective, they get to, you know, and I like Rancière, but I think that it does kind of enable a certain kind of broad and like kind of, affectively satisfying stance where you get to be like, well, we're just worried about exclusion. And it's like, but without actually saying that exclusion matters. And it seems to me that like there's certain kind like, so when he makes the claim that like every single police order, in that case the ideological institutional structure, is premised on some kind of an exclusion, but again he remains apparently neutral on whether or not that's a good or bad thing. And it seems to me that like we want some exclusions, right? Like we want an exclusion of, I don't know, white nationalists. We want an exclusion of certain things. So like, yeah, like exclusion, of course it's premised, but that's what I mean by there's like an ambiguity. I mean, maybe it's not ambiguous. Maybe he's just offering a descriptive account, and like that's what matters. And in which case, if it's descriptive, then maybe it's not even a criticism to say he's not offering a normative account, because ultimately he's just trying to give a description of politics. But at the same time, when he talks about like it's an eruption and an exemplification of like equality of excluded people rearing their head, disrupting, it sounds very like heroic and normative. So anyway, that was just like the sort of like oscillating back and forth between, as I was reading it, between being like, this is normative, it's not normative. And, you know, he even says somewhere, like, I think it's like when he's responding to, well, of course, he's always responding to Honneth about normativity. I think it's on page 119, 120, right? And he's like, you know, it's not that we base things on, or we're trying to have a political eruption that's based on trying to generate new recognition or address certain kinds of pathologies of in people's lack of recognition. But he says, but people do it in order to construct another world, right? To create a new space. And he uses the example of Rosa Parks, right? Like she didn't sit on a particular place on the bus because she was suffering. This is about suffering. But because she just wanted to create a different kind of world. And I felt that this was a very strange and ambiguous claim to just be like, well, it's not premised on some kind of suffering. It's really just imagining a new world. And that to me seems like either smuggling in normativity or just being shifty and not admitting what your actual commitments are. So I don't know. That was.
Yeah, I mean, I see why you say that, but it's his account of politics and his idiosyncratic version of it that makes him push back on that. Because politics is spontaneous. That is, it can't be determined. So if Rosa Parks sat at the front of the bus because she was, I don't know, suffering from a lack of respect or a lack of recognition, then the story is just that she got fed up and so did politics as a result. But that's not spontaneous then. That's like dialectical. But spontaneous politics or insurrectionary politics performs the political act for the world they want to create, not because of what's happening in this one. And that's the important distinction there.
Yeah. I want to follow this up by just giving an example of actually something that many of the Frankfurt Schoolers have started to talk about, third, fourth generation Frankfurt Schoolers talk about. That's actually indicatory of how it is that this can be carried out at the kind of micro-political lens. So just, in answer to kind of Eric's question, I don't think like Honneth is saying that experts should kind of resolve these questions. What he's saying is that they're technical questions that are best answered democratically, right? In fact, he's very critical of Hegel precisely for actually assuming that we should have a bureaucratic universal class that assumes it has the kind of answers to these questions and is going to manage them on behalf of society. And he thinks that's wrong, and he insists on that.
The Vanguard Party.
Yeah, and I think he's very critical of Leninism for exactly that reason, right? But what I mean by the fact that, you can't avoid the burdens of moral judgment and determining the kind of forms that inclusion and exclusion will take is that oftentimes the kind of practicality of these questions has to be answered in some way, shape, or form. And it's not always clear what the answer is going to be. And approaching them purely from an aesthetic level loses some of the grain that appears when we try to tackle these things in their concreteness. And one example I'll give that a lot of attention to was given was in Canada in 2015, Loyola versus Quebec. Has anyone here heard of this case at the Supreme Court?
Nay.
Okay, so it's a big case that concerns how to actually recognize religious minorities in Canada in the education system. And one of the things that the court had to ask was, what would it mean to have the most inclusive kind of education system at the primary level? Does it mean that you teach that religion is all false, right? And teach a purely secular kind of religious education? Well, some people would say that that's extremely discriminatory towards people who have religious beliefs, right? Do you teach that all religions are equal, right? People say, well, that could also be discriminatory because if I teach that all religions are equal, but I hold to a concrete religious viewpoint, like I'm a Roman Catholic in this case, then teaching me that my religion is just the same as someone else kind of discriminates me and gets me in a certain sense, right? And then other people have said, well, we should just have private schools for all different religious denominations, and everyone should be taught that their religion is right within that silo, right? This is a very difficult question to answer, and it's not clear what the most inclusive form of education would be.
And then atheists learn on the streets.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not worth noting this is something that Rancière also pays attention to, since it's a big issue in Quebec as well, France as well, where the kind of secularist laïcité that discriminate against Islam by teaching that really there is no God, or at least he has no place in the classrooms, is extremely controversial, right? But there's no getting around the question of trying to devise an education system that's more inclusive by purely aestheticizing it. You have to, at a certain point, ask yourself, what's the kind of educational or pedagogical model that would be most inclusive? And I think the way to settle that, circa both Rancière and Honneth, would be democratically. Right.
You keep using aestheticizing diminutively, which makes me think that you don't understand it.
No, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with aestheticizing something. I'm saying that aestheticizing something in the way that Rancière does has its place when it comes to talking about how it is that we should include different voices that have been excluded for a very long period of time and not presume certain kind of intellectual authority to speak on behalf of others, right? But I do think that once we move beyond aestheticization into the realm of political theory, which is what Honneth does, that's a realm where we have to start making practical judgments about, for instance, going back to what I was talking before, what kind of pedagogical model is the most inclusive one?
Yeah, but you want to answer that, and Rancière doesn't want to answer that, because Rancière wants the people to answer that when they come into conflict with the state. But you want to answer that for the state, for Rancière now.
No, I don't. And I've said that I want this to be answered democratically, right? But I'm saying that there has to be an answer, right?
Maybe I'm wrong here, but my general take from what Rancière was trying to do is almost reverse the direction, like not start with the normative claims, but rather have the normative claims follow from the aesthetic. Because when you think about aesthetics, right, it's not that there isn't normative claims in aesthetic. Aestheticizing something doesn't imply that you are getting rid of all of the normative claims in your discourse, right? Because when you think aesthetics, even if we're not talking about a theory of beauty as what most people think of as aesthetics, you're thinking of aesthetics as a theory of perception, about how perception works, about what sorts of objects we should regard as admirable and what sorts of objects we should regard as not so admirable, right? And these are the sorts of things that are imagined in, say, literary worlds, which is why he refers to literature like In Search of Lost Time and is in as a part of a political argument, which seems very strange, right? But that's what he's doing. He's grounding normative claims in an aesthetic understanding as opposed to in a social sciences and social philosophical understanding, which generally starts with ethics, which has its own kind of normative claims. And then if you go into the logic and the sciences, they have their own sorts of normative claims as well. Like, we're not talking about what Benjamin called the aestheticization of politics, which is exemplified by films like The Triumph of the Will, which just completely knocks morality straight out of politics. We're still kind of talking here about the politicization of aesthetics, as Benjamin would call it, which is to make sorts of normative claims about aesthetics, but obviously we have to be careful. And Rancière brings this up, right? Like when the working class people wanted to get into art and writing poetry and things like that, right? The normative assumption in that case was that they should be writing about things they know, like, I don't know, living in the slums or doing their jobs.
Yeah, painting their work boots.
But they wanted to appropriate bourgeois themes, noble themes, romantic themes that seem proper to a different section of society. And that in itself has an implicit normative claim, but we're just not starting with the normative. You forget norma is a carpenter's square. And a carpenter's square implies a kind of ratio. So what we're dealing with whenever we're talking about normativity is rationality. What is the legitimacy of claims to one rationality or multiple rationalities in our political discussions? So all that stuff can't just be ignored when we're saying we're aestheticizing something, because it's not that simple. When I assume, this is my take, it could be wrong. When we're dealing with someone like Rancière, who's probably not the class clown, I think he's a pretty smart guy. He's probably thought of these things, right?
Yeah, so wait. We're way too heady right now. I just need to at least get a crux that we can all talk about, and that's a good one to start on, is what are we talking about when we're talking about aesthetics for Rancière? When we say we're dealing with the sensible, it's not really in a phenomenological sense, but it's also not separate from that. But I think the closest thing would be common sense. So Rancière's big idea is that we can change common sense. and that it's not only the powerful that change common sense. You can be a cobbler and be able to access, reform, shape common sense. And not just yours, but like communally. So we're trying to get to a politics of the common sense, which means how do these things get generalized or normalized? And then how do you make them democratic and equal? So that's like square one. Anyway, someone else want to take it away? I feel like I feel like we may have lost a lot of people. So if we can try to build up from there.
I mean, I really wanted to push on this idea of grounding, because to me the most, or at least I thought at least one of the more interesting disagreements, and maybe the central one, is like what we've been talking about in terms of normativity. And like I take Eric's point about like the locating it in that aestheticization doesn't mean like some sort of like radically divorced from normative like ideal. But I think for me, the difficulty I have with Rancière, even though I agree with his analysis, like I actually think he's right about his what I take to be his descriptive project, which is exactly what Pill's described. That like that he's describing the process by which common sense, which includes the sensible, and it includes what earlier we described as, the ideological and institutional structures of the everydayness, the way that those things get ruptured and changed and reconfigured in these like moments of rupture. I think that that's compelling and accurate, and I feel like that seems intuitive to me. But I think that, there's a part where Rancière is disagreeing with Honneth's claim that for him it's about recognition. He says on page 119, for me it's quite dangerous to propound this idea of a kind of normativity defined in terms of the good relation to yourself. It generates an idea of a struggle for recognition as a kind of reaction against a state of frustration. And I thought that, so this is basically Honneth's claim, I guess, is that like these political struggles are grounded in some kind of feeling like we're not fitting into some broader structure, and there's some sort of state of frustration. This is at least Rancière giving Honneth. But then later, as I was saying earlier, right, he says, it's people don't struggle because they're trying to address some state of frustration in themselves. They struggle, and he says on page 120, to construct another world. And then that's when he uses the Rosa Parks example. And I guess like that's the part where I feel like it feels like thin to me.
Reconfiguration of the sensible, like what literature performs,
and it's
right?
like it feels thin, and it also feels like, well, why would we care about constructing another world? It's like, is that good? But he refuses to say why we would want to construct another world. He's like, no, there's no state of frustration with ourselves. That's dangerous to say that, but we just want to construct another world because that's what we do when we rupture the political. So like, but surely Rosa Parks wants a different world, because it's frustrating to live in a world where black people have to sit at the back of the bus. Like it seems wrong to me to be like, that has nothing to do with like any state of frustration.
Honneth did have a very strong critique there, I think, of Rancière, because Rancière didn't want to like start with the idea of suffering. Yeah. And for Honneth, it acts as like a bridge, right, between like political discourse and what you were saying about, this idea of having an incomplete and a complete self, I guess, or sort of things matching up with the self. And he said, Honneth accused, if Rancière wants to eject this idea of starting with struggle, or at least with suffering, or at least using it as a bridge between the sort of, what does he call it? Like the individual and pathologies versus the political. He says you owe us then an explanation about what is the driving force behind your ideas, right? It's not desire for equality, because Rancière already said, no, that's just the definition of politics. That's not a desire. But it doesn't start with suffering, because suffering is a negative reactionary thing. So then, like, what the hell is it, Ranci?
And then he just says it's you want to create a better world, but why? Or a different world, not even better. That's too normative. It's just trying to create, and it's like, what do you mean? And that's where I think that
it's good in itself, right?
That's where he's sneaking in. That's where they sneak in the normativity, right there.
Yeah,
that's where they're smuggling it in.
Yeah.
I know you love this sneaking in thing. It sounds very nefarious, conspiratorial, but normativity does not need to be universalizable. They're not trying to avoid it for that reason. Like equality is not universalizable. because it's always going to become a new status quo, a new police. But
Oh, okay.
look, the reason that it can't be normative as a first step is just like all our other favorite French pimps, they don't want Hegel. So if you ever start by going, Rosa Parks sat at the front of the bus in order to move history forward. Well, now fuck, politics is history again. So Rancierian politics is not historical. It's spontaneous. So certain people, I guess you're one of them, are going to want the why in advance. Why are we doing this? So if your personal answer is, we should do this because it's right, then you're probably a dialectician. But if your personal answer is something more along the lines of, I want to seize upon a moment where I can bear out my will and creativity in the world, then you may be a Rancierian, whose critique of the police in this sense is similar to the Nietzschean critique of Hegel's
Here, I can give you an account,
dialectic.
if you want, of how it is that a lot of these people bridge the gap between aesthetics and politics. It's not particularly sophisticated, and the best iteration of it is given in Habermas's late book, Truth and Justification, I think is the name of it. But one of the things that they point out
Did you
is
say
that
Habermas's late book?
late book, yeah, it's from 2001, Truth and Justification. It's a collection of essays.
Sorry. I thought you meant the late Habermas's book, or like
still
where
alive.
the book died.
No.
Yeah, that was like I didn't.
No.
I'm expecting it any day now. It's gonna happen
He's
soon.
he's actually just releasing a 1,400-page book that apparently is actually much more Marxist in its orientation than he's been since the 1970s. So just like Honneth seems to have felt the sting of not being radical enough, Habermas has seemed to have decided that he's not radical enough at this point.
They're done getting kicked around by podcasts.
Yeah, exactly. He's too much of a square, so he's kind of responding to that. Actually, Igor Shokobrod pointed this out. He apparently wrote an email to Igor saying that my new book is going to be more radical than my last. But anyway, the kind of argument that
we got
these
him.
people make, the kind of argument that these people make very simply is that aesthetics constitutes a kind of cultural life world, and it's a very Hegelian idea from which people draw grammars, symbols, and images that they reconfigure and rearticulate in order to demand recognition, both from other people, from state institutions, and from various other kinds of cultural forces in society, right? And there's an indefinite quality to this because, of course, just like the cultural world of aesthetics is endlessly rich, so too will people reconfigure these symbols, grammars, and so on in endlessly various different ways. And there's a democratic dimension to this because the argument that most of them will put forward is that, rather like what Rancière is doing, we should consider the different ways that people reassemble their grammars and aesthetic images from an egalitarian perspective and not try to privilege one over the other. Right? Except that becomes really difficult because, of course, at some point you need to start to ask yourself, well, how is it that we take these kind of demands from recognition and translate them into political practice, right? So one of the examples given by Sheila Benhabib, for example, at length is she'll point out that a lot of Marxists have criticized the notion of human rights, right? By saying human rights is just a bourgeois notion. Anytime you codify rights in the law, inevitably the state's going to be the one that decides what those rights are. So we should just abandon talk of rights wholesale, right? But Benhabib will say, actually, people have been able to use the grammar of rights in a lot of very interesting ways, sometimes for extremely revolutionary causes, right? If you think about the French Revolution and the demand for the universal rights of man, per se, right? And this shows you that you can take the grammar of an aestheticized concept like right and employ it for democratic and even radical purposes without interpolating it in a system of control and power. And the problem is how to actually create a kind of social order that allows people to do that on an indefinite basis, while still providing them with the minimal series of concrete institutions that's necessary to do that. And also a high level of material equality, since if they're not actually materially capable of engaging in these kinds of projects, then they're not going to be able to do so, since most of them are going to be sitting there toiling away for capitalists day in and day out, rather than engaging in these kinds of acts of civic participation and rearticulation, right?
Yeah.
So there is a kind of link between aesthetics and between politics that they draw that's relatively sophisticated. Again, Habermas's account is better than Honneth's, a lot better than Honneth's, frankly. I think it's really problematic in a lot of ways, right? But I think that the reason why it is that maybe Pills and I were having an argument is that I'm not trying to dismiss aesthetics, and neither is Honneth, right? The disagreement seems to lie on how it is that you take, from Honneth's perspective, I think would be, how do you take the resources in an aestheticized life world and translate that into some kind of praxis, right? Democratic praxis.
So one connection that I can bring up based on what Matt just said, this aesthetics to politics bridge, is the individual and how the individual gets rights and how the individual gets recognized. So for Honneth, he's very concerned with being recognized, or the subject being recognized. And Rancière kind of goes, oh yeah, well, the state recognizes you. It's just going to call you, it recognizes you as a colonial subject if you're in Algeria, and a citizen if you're born in France. So for Rancière, it's not that the state doesn't recognize you. It's that the state turns you in the kind of individual that gets recognized, and then you're unequal. So I would wondered what you guys thought about this debate about the individual, because this is one thing we've talked a lot about on this podcast in terms of identity. Whereas Rancière is like, we don't want identity to be the normative bearer of rights. We want something else, something discursive. Whereas Honneth,
it almost seems like he wants to deny it.
Yeah. So you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, I mean, so I think that Rancière's interpretation of what Honneth's up to, and actually, I wrote my major paper for my master's in philosophy about Honneth and Rawls, so I know Honneth pretty well, and I know that he is not only concerned with how the individual is recognized by the state, but also this broader sense of the norms that I think there's actually overlap in what Rancière means by the police, meaning all the ways in which the everydayness is, maintained ideologically, but also institutionally. And that's why Honneth has these three spheres of recognition, which we can take issue with. But he is very much concerned with also just how your identity gets formed, not in terms of, of course the state's always going to have some sort of effect, but also your the everyday way in which you sort of interact with people at the level of what you might call cultural value patterns. And I think that Honneth is concerned with changing those, and he wants to ground them in a kind of normativity of subjective development, right? And what he calls this kind of good relation to yourself. He wants to locate that in this Hegelian dialectical account of subject development.
Yeah, we call that the dialectic of recognition on here, right?
Right. Yeah, the dialectic of recognition. So, and I think that the problem that I think Rancière has is he doesn't really care about any of that, it seems, or doesn't want to talk about it specifically. He just wants to eschew the whole conversation of the individual, and just wants to talk about vague things. I was criticizing him earlier for just saying, well, people do these things, they rupture the existing orders to create a new world, construct something new, and it's but doesn't want to say whether or not that's good. And then the other thing that I would say,
what is it Deleuze says? Bring something new into the world. It seems like
it's just because I guess that's intrinsically good or something. But I don't know. But of course they would never want to say that. Or I don't want to speak of Deleuze, but at least here for Rancière. But I think there was a really interesting debate where Honneth responds to something Rancière says with saying, well, why can't we change society? Why does it have to be? And maybe he was misreading Rancière here a little bit, but he was basically asking, why do these changes to the existing, what Rancière calls the police order, have to only take place in the context of this rupture, right? Why can't you work within the system to slowly erode on some understanding of identity? And I don't know, we could think of the example of something like transgender identity or something. It's I think at least there's an interesting question about what happens that now there's more recognition for transgender in the everyday culture today than there's ever been. Was that the result of a rupture, or is that just a continuation of the already existing logic of our neoliberal context, right? But the result, from the perspective of being a transgender person, is likely positive. But was that a change? I'd be curious what you guys think. Yeah, was that a change in the configuration of the police, or was that some sort of an already existing logic being the logic of it being extended to its natural conclusion?
Doesn't seem like that can happen for Rancière. This is one of those points that might put the radicals off of Honneth, though, because I think what you're getting at is his idea that instead of the whole like political intervention and the suspension of the political order, he was talking about, well, why can't we have like an internal struggle where we reappropriate and reinterpret certain normative values? Like, I don't know what you think of, like he gives us one example of the housewife, and that's his example of somebody trying to like shirk off an identity that's being imposed on them and sort of reinterpret their possible role in politics or in society. And then he talks about this idea of reinterpreting normative values. Like, I don't know, we live in a profit driven society. Could we reinterpret that? And he says, this is what we might have traditionally called reform. And then all the revolutionaries go, oh, fuck.
Yeah, exactly. And but I think to be charitable to Honneth, I think that his point is exactly what you said. But I don't think in that response he was denying that it's possible to also have these changes occur exactly as Rancière says.
The external struggle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But his point was just like, but it seems strange to be like, that's the only time it can change.
No, not to say that those things don't change, not to say that, but to say that that is not political action. Like, if you're already at the point where women can vote and where transgender people are recognized by the state, that's because a lot of people have already done the aesthetic work of changing common sense, and those people did the politics.
Well, here, though, I think it's really important to note the different...
I want to talk more about that in a second, but okay, Matt,
I'll be quick. Okay, I promise. I think it's really important to note the different traditions in which Rancière and Honneth are operating, right? In the kind of context of the German Frankfurt School, particularly third generation Frankfurt School theory, Hannah Arendt becomes an extremely major figure. And she still is for people like Honneth and Benabib, right? And one of the things that Hannah Arendt foregrounds in all of her work that they all pick up on is that the only thing worse than having a state oppress you is not having a state that's willing to oppress you, right? Being completely excluded from the political community and having no rights that anybody is willing to guarantee, right? So I think Honneth would argue that demands for recognition on behalf of legal institutions and demands for rights for your cultural group are a necessary but not sufficient condition for the kind of more radical forms of political agitation that you're arguing. And the example you could point to would be something like Algerians in France, right? Which Rancière should be aware of, right? Any of them would probably much prefer to be recognized as an official religion by the French state with all the compromises that are entailed with that, rather than being treated essentially as though they don't belong in France. And they're just going to eternally be othered in that kind of civic context. And at its apex, this is going to lead to demands that they go home, like Marine Le Pen is saying. Right? Even
that was Matt being short.
The novelized version of that will be out next week.
So yeah, you were saying like the systemic logic. I'm still want to pick up on this point that Pills made earlier. Is the thing that Rancière is interested in. So I guess like, because originally I framed it as sort of like a question. So the example of like transgender or like changes in the recognitional economy of society that happen from within the logic, I posed the question, right? So would that just not qualify as an actual change, an interruption in the police? Or would it be, or would you conceptualize it that way? So I guess based on what you said, Pills, the answer would be like, no, because it's actually just a continuation of the systemic logic, right? Because like the expansion of like transgender rights or other things, that's just fitting into the logic, the systemic logic of the society we live in. It's not an authentic rupture.
Well, isn't that the same thing as saying like the Declaration for the Rights of Women is based formally on the Declaration of the Rights of Man, therefore it is just based on the sort of formal logic of something that's already a kind of normative principle. He talks about love in the same way, kind of.
It's a little unfair
right?
to Mary Wollstonecraft. She was actually pretty original.
But look, when you're at the point, especially of legal recognition, that is of police state interpolation, then at that point, yes, that is just a continuation of the police state. But the question is, how did we get there? And what political acts did it take to get there? How did it get to be common sense that women should have the right to vote? The suffragettes did that. They were the political actors there. Police state is still going to police. So when it comes to transgender recognition now, in the same way, if the laws change to recognize them, then that means that politics is over. And that politics has been, 50 years in the making of work by activists, by artists, by people who broke
like the
laws.
Stonewall riots in the 60s.
Yeah, by transgender people who came out in spite of the risk of ostracism and probably violence in a lot of cases. So they risk their safety and well-being because that is the better world. And that act of coming out to society in the face of a lot of bad shit that's going to get thrown your way and happen to you, that is the political act. So when you're at the point where fucking Justin Trudeau is wearing a transgender pin on TV, then politics has long been over at that point.
Right.
Yeah, but
I think that
I don't think that's.
I think that fits. No, hold on. I think that fits with I think Honneth would just say, well, yeah, of course. I mean, those acts. So the acts themselves are political moments, right? When it's dangerous, and that is leading to like a reconfiguration of the common sense with which people perceive transgender people, which then makes it possible for the state to change, is what you're saying, because of those actual concrete acts that were dangerous in that moment. Okay. I think that makes sense, and I think that Honneth would still make room for that. But I think what he would say would be like, the reason that those acts matter is because of like a recognitional demand that is motivating those acts.
And because they got rights in the end. So Honneth's like, okay, it's good. They got rights in the end. Now they're recognized.
Well, it's not just about rights. It's about recognition.
But
I'm sorry. You keep saying that. But it's not just respected. But I think that it's the exact same thing. Like, implicit in Honneth is a concern with a change in the common sense values that that those acts required. And the reason why it matters to have like regular people see transgender people as different, because before, obviously, when they had to do those political acts and come out and be, at risk, that was because the common sense was such that it looked down or marginalized transgender people much more than it still does now. But the reason that Honneth would support that, it's not because of rights, but he's actually concerned with those common senses. The common sense is the thing that makes better recognitional economy possible.
I didn't get that from this reading, though.
I think the problem with these examples is they can both appropriate them with their conceptual apparatuses, right? Honneth can say, no, that's an example of someone completing and becoming recognized and moving towards this concept of freedom that he has. Rancière can say, no, that's actually someone subjectivizing outside of like the identity circuit and moving towards a concept of equality. They can both take the examples and run them through their system and account for them in different ways that both sound pretty cogent to me. But then the problem then becomes something on a theoretical conceptual level if they can both just do this very easily whenever an example is
real
thrown
quick
up.
Though, Pills, real quick. So you're right that it's not specifically in this text the way that I stated it, but it is implied because his concern is about the self relationship and all the conditions that lead to a healthy self relationship, which would include the common sense of society. He fleshes that out more in like his other works. But you're right that it wasn't stated the way that I did in this text, but that's all implied by his dialectic of recognition for Honneth.
All right. Well, it sounds good. I'd be a little less hostile if he stated it that way instead of being like, hey, you guys did it. Good job, Rosa Parks. You did what I now say you should have done.
But then what's with Rancière just saying that, like, not wanting to admit that, like, a constructing another world is good for a reason? Like, that's just weird to me.
Can you point me to the reference, maybe?
So it's page 120, 119, 120, when Rancière is responding to the idea where it's actually, like, kind of like bottom quarter. He says it's quite dangerous to propound the idea of a kind of normativity defined in terms of a good relationship to yourself. And then he goes on to talk about a female candidate running for office because she did it not because she was frustrated and had a bad relationship with her relation to herself, but because she wanted to construct another world. And then he says Rosa Parks also, right? She sat there not because she was tired after a day of work. It was because of her right.
I have an inkling that this
and the right of all her sisters
is about something we have not explained yet, which is Rancière's concept of the partition of the sensible. I think
that's important.
This is linked to that, like, totally, and we haven't gone over it yet, and I don't think I can explain it.
I also wanted to point out that I think there's an important sense in which we also have to acknowledge that the granting of rights by a state or another institution can sometimes precede changes in the sensus communis. And this is something we talk a lot about in the socio-legal literature, right? Do changes in the law reflect changes in culture, or do changes in culture reflect changes in law? And actually, there's been a lot of empirical research done on the subject, and it turns out it's a lot more complicated than just assuming cultural changes precede legal changes. So, for instance, in a lot of countries, attitudes towards homosexuality were uniformly pretty negative on behalf of the majority of people until there was a legal change permitting it, after which people's minds just changed, right? They said, well, if the law says it's okay, then it must be okay. There are similar empirical examples that pertain to drug use, similar laws that pertain to abortion use, and probably the most prominent example, aside from the LGBTQ one, is the death penalty. Most people supported the death penalty until their states prohibited it. Right. So I do think it's actually possible to grant people and groups rights. And a lot of activists demand this even in the face of public pressures and the sensus communis, and then hope that there are going to be transitions in the broader culture afterwards. Right.
Sorry, are you using that word in the Aristotelian and the Thomist sense of being able to make like cognitive judgments about objects that share similar qualities? So that's what sensus communis means. I don't think it doesn't mean common sense like we say today.
No, yeah, I'm using it in the kind of colloquial sense that we were talking about it earlier on, right? But the basic idea is that, and I think it's
Latin in for fun.
Yeah, well, it's a fun.
I knew what you meant, and I thought it was cool. And then Eric came in and was like, "Yeah, I don't think
it doesn't mean that at all.
Excuse me,
don't
sir.
say it in the Latin. So say I'm using common sense in the sort of pseudo pragmatist sense of American philosophy.
I enjoyed the
The reason I think it's important, though, is to Victor's point, right? Take the civil rights movement, right, in the American South. The civil rights movement was extremely unpopular in the American South, and it was only tepidly popular in the American North, right? Nowadays, it's granted this kind of almost hagiographic status in American culture, right? But that's not the way it was at the time, right? And one of the things that's important to remember is that it took a lot of activists putting pressures on political elites to grant rights to people of color before society was willing to change, right? So sometimes I get a little bit wary of this kind of argument that we need to wait for cultural changes to lead to the granting of rights.
I don't think that's.
I don't think that's what Rancière is saying.
Yeah, okay.
Right? I'm just kind of cautioning that. Jim.
So what you're saying, I think what you're saying could be possible, but would be definitely the exception, not the rule. Which is that a politician could actually do a political act. It could, in theory, be possible, according to Rancière, of course.
Well, some great politicians do. I mean, look at Martin Luther King, right? Like Martin Luther King was such a morally upstanding figure that even in the face of tremendous public opposition, he was able to enact meaningful change in the United States. Right?
He's not a politician, though.
Well, political figure. Sorry. Yeah, not a politician. Civil rights activist, right? It's the same thing for activists against the death penalty, right? The death penalty was hugely popular in most countries. Still is in some senses. But they really put a huge amount of moral pressure on state institutions to say that this is a violation of human rights, and they were successful, right? And I don't think anybody here would be complaining about that, right? So I think it's sometimes more complicated than just saying we need changes in kind of cultural attitudes. Sometimes there's things that activists can do that.
Well, all those things interlink, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's actually Honneth's point in his other work, that all these things, the legal level, the cultural value patterns level, and then also like the private, like our own intersubjective relationships with our loved ones, like all these spheres of recognition interlink and interact with each other to create like the conditions of a healthy self relationship.
Yeah, just give an example that we all know, we should all be familiar with. 2004, gay marriage gets decriminalized here in Canada. Most people I knew were pretty homophobic back in the early 2000s, which is not that long ago, right? And there's a lot of data to say that most of Canadian society was pretty homophobic at the time. Nowadays, flash forward 15 years later, there was a change to the law, and it proceeded a change in cultural attitudes because homophobia is now considered just as akin to racism in terms of something that's culturally taboo. And thank God for that, right? So, there are examples we can all point to where
LGBTQ movement goes back to, in the States, the Stonewall riots. And there's a similar event in Toronto, actually, in Canada, that launched the movement here as well. So they raided all the Turkish baths, and they did the same sort of police oppressive shit they did in the States, and it kind of congealed a movement. So I mean, I think wherever you start that, you have your distribution of the sensible, and then you have a dissensus which is created outside of that. and
that's why I think we can all
rupture that
agree,
forms.
fuck the police. That's the outcome of this entire discussion. Was ultimately
I like how he
was
chooses
right,
the
fuck
word the police too. It's funny how he chooses that word police.
Yeah.
It's like it's like design. It's like tailor made for edgelord seduction.
It has an aesthetic appeal for activism, right?
But that's
Yeah,
why
it does.
I think that's why Honneth has such a hard time dealing with Rancière, because he's like, this guy just redefined politics. He can't do that. He says that's something to that effect. That's my summary.
Yeah,
But-
I mean, I agree with you.
but-
I actually thought that Honneth's reactions were pretty bad. Like, I thought I felt like I had thought of better critiques of Rancière than Honneth himself did myself.
Yeah, but that's
It's
like
kind of lazy.
Rancière obviously wants politics to have nothing to do with the polis, or to be undermining of the polis, and it makes sense why that would be a good. In general, not a historical good. I think that needs to be qualified. Not a historical good, but to see the world reflect you, I think you have to claim that that's a good. Because otherwise, what would be the point of doing aesthetics?
Right. I mean,
And I
it's-
don't think
it's-
that's smuggled in, though. I think that maybe he doesn't state it. I don't know.
I mean, there's a couple places like so. Even on 126, there's another moment when they're talking about suffering, right? And like Rancière is really insistent on being like, we don't have this point about suffering in common at all, and he says he says the logic of the police to define the wrong on a pathological basis, it's not necessarily because people are suffering that they act politically. Acting politically very often comes because some forms of ruptures appear possible.
Yeah, like an
So, like,
opportunity.
I just think that just
It's
seems like
opportunistic.
weird to me, that it's just like it's almost it sounds a bit deterministic. It's just like, just because there's an opportunity, people are gonna take it. I don't know, and it's just like he doesn't want to admit that like it. I mean, I guess it depends on how you define suffering, I suppose. But I was being like charitable to Honneth and thinking that suffering has to do with a deficiency in all of these spheres of recognition that include culture and common sense and all these things. And it just seems to me that mostly, I mean, I don't understand how you could say that people just blindly are like, well, there's an opportunity to change things, I'm going to take it, but like not have
There's no cops on the street. Let's go smash.
there's nothing behind it, like some demand, like that just seems like very strange to me.
But you can see
and it
why,
seems like
right? You know why. It's like if something's determined, then it's not political anymore. If you're just doing something because you're an instinctless flesh creature bumping into things, then it doesn't matter. The only thing, the only way that can matter is if it can be spontaneous for you.
Yeah, I think for Rancière, what moves equality along as well, in his sense of everyone having equal capacity to participate in politics, what moves that along is disagreement. Whereas with Honneth, what leads towards freedom and recognition is agreement and consensus, right? So they have diametrically opposed views on that, right? And this reproduces a lot of what was different between Habermas and Luhmann, a generation before them, right? Like Luhmann thought that when consensus emerged, this is when society just dies because there's no more tension, right? Whereas what the point of communicative action, which is Habermas's theory that Honneth is now taking over, is forming rational consensus, which must be based on agreement on normative principles. So if you have that sort of radical challenge to this, seeming sensible position, which forces Rancière into saying some like strange things, like we've been pointing out, but it makes sense, if vigilance and not losing the gains that we've already made is something that requires constant disagreement with what's going on, then it makes sense to me. I don't know.
And if you want to hear a slaughter of a debate, a slaughter of a fight night, it's Luhmann versus Habermas, who didn't even know that his pants were being pulled out from underneath him.
I want to say, I think we should take this as an opportunity. I think we should take this as an opportunity to propose another podcast on Alain Badiou, actually, because I think, Victor, if you're interested in this kind of idea of an eventual politics, or politics of rupture, as it's sometimes called, Rancière's is like reasonably interesting, but Badiou is really the one who theorizes on this and systematizes it in their most robust possible way, because he really does ascribe these kind of revolutionary moments an ontological significance in like the capital O sense of the word, right? Which is that the state always operates to kind of establish an order of being that it wants. And what constitutes a genuine politics is the event where the order of being breaks down and you realize that you can recreate the world, right? And
Sure, that sounds interesting.
it is. I mean, you can read his little book, Metapolitics, on this, but I think it cashes out a lot of what Rancière is getting.
We got to stick with that verses theme, though, right?
If
Pills?
we do Badiou in verses, we got to bring in Deleuze, of course. Deleuze versus Badiou. And then we can tag team in Zizek versus Deleuze, because Zizek takes Badiou's side.
I need to read Deleuze, just because why is it that everyone online loves Deleuze? It's just it's by far the most popular. Eric, I thought you had to leave. What's going on here?
I feel our street cred fading away. Yeah, no, I must say that's a pretty deep power move, suggesting what our next reading should be live on the air. Kudos.
Well,
we're not
I just think if we're going to talk about this kind of eventual politics or politics of rupture, I think it's best to always try to find somebody who espouses the idea in its most coherent possible term. And
and you keep saying that, Matt. You haven't. You just because you like someone better doesn't mean they are better.
Sure, but I mean, I thought you would agree with this, right?
No disagreement.
No, but I think that there's no doubt that Badiou, as a systematic philosopher who talks about these things, is more comprehensive than Rancière is, right?
Well,
I mean, it's not that Rancière is better or worse. It's just that he incorporates this into a bigger project than Rancière does. And trying to figure out how this eventual politics has become popular in the late 21st century, I think that it's an argument that Badiou has played a much bigger role in that than even someone like Rancière.
I actually like Rancière quite a lot, to be honest. I know it sounds, and maybe it doesn't sound like that, but like of all the edgelord like political theorists, like he's like my favorite one because I
was expecting you to hate
to me,
because he does all the things that you normally complain about.
So to be honest with you, the thing that I really like about Rancière, and like, you know, I think maybe I know we're getting close to the time to end it and the podcast, but you know, the thing that I really like about him is the claim that like this resistance to politics has to be momentary, and that there's always going to be a reconfiguration of the police order, that like you can't have, and I think the reason I like it is because I first read him in the context of other people who have this, I think, really like cringed dream about like this kind of perpetual political mobilization where you're always putting pressure, always, and they think that, oh, maybe we can get to like a fully unalienated politics where there's like direct, where we get rid of all the things. And what I like about Rancière is I read him at least as saying, well, that's not really possible. That's never going to be possible, because always spontaneously we return to some sort of a police order where things get routinized and common sense becomes smoothed over, and you can only ever achieve these moments. And that seems right to me. So like as a kind of a descriptive account, I really like him, and I think he offers something interesting.
Yeah, I mean, Robert Dow once said that of all the emotions that have been most underestimated by philosophers and in particular political theorists, boredom is the one that's been paid the least attention to. And what I like Rancière for is his politics is fundamentally one that's committed to an anti-boredom, right? Anytime things get stultified, anytime things get calcified, somebody, you know, as Pill said, is going to come along and say, this is an opportunity for me to smash things up and shake it up, to bring something new into the world, right? And I think any critical theorist is always going to have a little bit of sympathy for that.
What's our Benjamin quote? Boredom is the songbird that hatches the egg of experience, and a rustle in the bushes will scare it away.
This is a politics of creativity, and I'm happy that the two politics guys got something out of it, because often your concern is, well, what do we do? Tell me, give me the model, give me the structure, give me the thing. But if the structure is always don't get caught in structure, then that's a different type of narrativization of the process of politics, which isn't really political theory anymore. It's kind of I don't know what you'd call this.
Yeah.
Theory.
Well, I think for me it was useful. It was useful for me to really think about Rancière as offering a more of a descriptive account. Like, so that's the way in which I find him to be like useful. Because I just think I think his description of how that process occurs, and I think there's a way of even reading history to be pretty consistent with what he talks about, like the history of political struggles. Like, I think there's just a lot to like in what he's saying about that. But yeah, I mean, in terms of who am I going to go to for like actually adopting some like political convictions, I mean, Rancière to me seems very thin. Other than like, but that's not why I like him anyway. Yeah. So it doesn't matter.
This is the thing. Pills and I started off by kind of arguing kind of heatedly about this. And this is the thing. I do politics, right? So I'm always trying to interpret how it is that this can be incorporated into a kind of more concrete politics.
You write about politics. Let's be real.
Sorry?
You write about politics.
Yeah, sure. But I mean, that's not to say that I don't appreciate the aesthetic dimension to life a lot, right? And quite frankly, this really applies to actually these essays, because I thought that Honneth's essay, even though I tended to agree with it a little bit more, was really boring, right? I just kind of read it and I nearly fell asleep twice because I'm like, oh, he's just saying this old thing again. Ranciere's essay was lively and vital and had interesting examples and was written in a pretty crisp fashion. So,
yeah, Honneth's essay was a bit of a snooze fest. I gotta admit, yeah, Honneth was, and he was, and I also agree with Pills. We had a little exchange in our Pill Pod Messenger group, and I absolutely agreed with Pills that Honneth seemed a little bit thick-headed and like didn't really understand some of the points that Rancière was making, and I was like, this is just a pretty bad reading of your interlocutor.
Well, he also admitted that. He said, I think there must be an argument here, but it might be one of these three. I'm just not sure which. And it was none of them.
It's true. Do you guys also pick up on the fact that it always seemed like Honneth was trying to find, as I guess a good liberal always tries to find, like points of agreement? He was like, I feel like we agree on this. I feel like we agree on this. And then Rancière never did that once. He never was like, I think we agree on this.
Well, sometimes it's like always the danger, right? When I agree with you, but I actually didn't understand what you said. So I'm just saying I agree with you to shut down the conversation. That always seems to be the case. But then you guys notice there's a interesting part where Rancière was talking about love, and Honneth picked up on it and thought it was pretty awesome, and he spoke about it. I guess this is the transcript of a dialogue at some points, but he spoke about it afterwards, saying like that was a pretty cool thing. But I didn't totally understand it, but it seemed like a normative thing that Rancière was doing, right? He was saying like, this is how love works, not like the Winnicott sort of love between a child and a mother, and the mother is the transitional object until the child learns to love in a socially correct manner. But he's talking about love as like inherently multiple, as a sort of aesthetic experience of narrowing something down to an individual and constructing the object of your desire. And what, like, he talks about this idea of seeing like a gaggle of girls coming along on the beach, and you sort of fall vaguely in love, but like not with any one of them in particular, just with like the whole sort of vague scene. And then as you sort of, like the artist who you construct the world, or you construct the object, one of them eventually sort of fits into it. It's like a dialectical process on an aesthetic level, and Honneth actually seemed to really like that. It was kind of an interesting exchange at one point. I liked it.
I was just imagining some just perverted Frenchman sitting with his cigarette. He's like 65. He's 65 on a beach in southern France, and there's a bunch of girls walking forward, and he's like, "Oh, hello, bonjour, mes filles. Je pense que je tombe amoureux de vous."
Yeah, we could have a creative act together, right? Yeah. No, but
lots of body hair going around.
I like French theory for that also, right? Because, and Victor, I'm sure maybe you'll agree with me on this, maybe you won't, but one of the things that you'll very rarely see political theorists who aren't Martha Nussbaum doing is talking about love, right? At most, you get civic friendship, right? That's the kind of idea we're supposed to aim for, this old Aristotelian idea. And it's really nice that French theorists are a lot less afraid of tackling those kind of big emotions and politicizing them in a kind of important way, right? Because
yeah, it's true, but it's also worth noting that one of Honneth's spheres of recognition is actually like love.
Well, yeah, that's why
he takes that over from Winnicott and that sort of psychoanalytic tradition, but love then just sort of boils down to an intersubjective relationship that we have to learn how to do right, otherwise we become maladapted to social norm.
You know who else talks about love?
Jesus.
Badu, who Matt has committed us to podcasting about.
I just thought Rancière's take on love was much more like rich and aesthetically exciting, and then from there you want to go, politics of love, baby.
I love. Did you guys see Rancière's picture on his Wikipedia? It's just like him standing in a meadow with like it's a strange photo.
Yeah, it looks like he's reaching out to the stars or something, or he's super high.
An old man Instagram fail. He's like,
he's got one strange. It's like he looks a little lost. He looks a little
one
lost.
arm is just hovering.
His eagle back to him.
He's got a pretty loose sweater. It's a strange image.
It's like his giant eagle's about to come land on his arm again. He's just cast it out.
I mean, let's get real. He's clearly very, very high, or at least he's had a couple bottles of wine. His granddaughter was like, "Go out into like the meadow. I'm going to take a picture of you." And then he kind of drunkenly or highly stumbled there, and then she'd snap the picture, and it's iconic. You know, that's a true act of love.
Or he escaped from his retirement community.
He's in the fields now.
You see, he's Algerian. That kind of brings some of that into context.
I didn't even see that.
He's Derridian.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, everyone from Algeria is Derrida. All right, guys, shall we wrap it up?
Yeah, I think that was pretty good.
Yeah, I made it through to the end.
Sorry for the exchanges of lectures in some cases, but I think
I don't know who. I don't know. I felt like most of us are. I think who did that? Who's responsible for that?
I did one. I think.
Yeah, I'd say it's very clearly Eric.
Shut up. Can you just shut the fuck up and make shorter points, please?
You love it. You all love it.
All right. Are we declaring a winner?
I mean,
no.
I think, in my opinion, I felt as though they were
Equality or
they
freedom.
matched some blows, but I think that, and I also think that they both kind of talked past each other. But I don't know. For me, it feels a little bit like a draw, with good points on both sides. I found it, but Honneth being more boring, so maybe I give an edge to Rancière.
Oh, centrist.
Bit of a wash.
Always centrist. I just
Bit of a wash.
Honneth lost because he's a Habermasian who showed up to a debate. So that's a big L.
He's
in
not
my
trying to
book.
win a debate. He's trying to reach consensus on what the right thing to do is, right? If he wins the debate, he loses because he devalues his own political commitments.
No, the politics of disagreement. I reassert it here and always.
Yeah,
All right.
I didn't actually know much about either of them when I came in, but I feel like my sensibilities match up with Rancière's a little more. Honneth did have some extremely important points and valiant criticisms, but Rancière just had some awesome points about recognition and love and all the rest of it. So I don't know. I think I don't know. But in terms of like who wins and like what's a better basis for addressing injustices? Is it Rancière's theory of equality or Honneth's theory of recognition? I would say both leave a lot to be desired.
Yeah, I would hesitate to declare a winner because while my sympathies lie more with Honneth, I also thought that, like Victor, it was an extremely boring essay. So I'm unwilling to actually say that it beats out Rancière's, because even though I found Rancière's kind of thin on the specifics, at least I wasn't bored, and I did think the stuff on love was moving and interesting and important. And who doesn't like talking about, allowing more people to narrativize? So I'm actually going to give it to Rancière. I like
All right,
Rancière.
Rancière is the winner. And next time you want to pick a political text, we could just read the side of a mayonnaise bottle. Just the ingredients list would result in the same outcome.
Did you really hate this much, Pills? Did you really hate it this much? I felt like you kind of enjoyed this.
I gotta extend the politics of disagreement to your reading choices also.
Real mayonnaise or salad dressing sauce?
No,
Which
just
one's better?
Miracle Whip.
McChicken
Just
sauce.
Straight up Miracle Whip.
Miracle Whip.
Anyway.
Yeah,
Don't
dressing.
ever use that.
I'll peace
All
out,
right.
guys.
Later.
All right.
Fatality.